welcome everybody who is joining us. I am here with Joshua Butler, who is Josh. It's been fun getting to know you, hanging out with you a little bit, and hearing a little about your life and your journey. And so, I don't want to introduce you first as an author. Obviously, you're an author and you're a speaker and you're a pastor. But man, it's just you're so accessible. So it's been great getting to know you in these past weeks, leading
Oh
up
man.
to our webinar. So
Thanks so much,
thanks.
Steve. Same. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah,
And
same.
for those who are joining in, Joshua, you're no stranger to the Alliance. I mean, you spoke at our district conference in one of our breakouts years ago. I remember that as your book, Skeletons in God's Closet, and you did a breakout session for that. So you know a little bit about who we are as a people.
Oh, thanks so
Um,
much, man. No, Steve, I love the Alliance. So actually, when I came to faith in college, I was in college and my mom had recently come to faith as well. And she was attending Salem Alliance Church in Salem. So I grew up in Kaiser, Salem area. I'm a McNary Salt for those who know the area there. But
mm,
that was my high school. But my mom, started attending church there, and we were both kind of new believers, and it was fun because we have a big family. I've got four brothers, and then my mom and dad. And my mom and I were kind of the two who really started following Jesus together around the same time, and separate avenues of how we came to faith, but then really growing together. So I'd always go visit Salem Alliance when I was there and got to know a number of kind of Alliance churches, then was a pastor in Portland for about 15 years, and knew some of the Alliance network in the Northwest area, and was always just so inspired and compelled by the work that God was doing in and through the Alliance churches. So yeah, man. So I know you were there for a good great season as well,
mhm.
and yeah, and even this summer, we were kind of in transition, moving back to the Northwest after a season away. And we're near my mom for the summer, and so I was attending Salem Alliance last summer as well. And Rob Bashiam there, shout out to him, and he was amazing. He didn't even know who I was. Most people don't. It was fine, but I was at church one Sunday, and he was like, "Hey, you look new. Can I take you out to lunch?" And so we went out to lunch and just had this great conversation, and then got to know each other better there. But which was so rad, and got to know each other over last summer. But so stoked on the Alliance and what God's doing in and through you,
Yeah,
man.
thanks. Well, it's funny because I reached out to Rob first and said, "Hey, man, would you be interested in being on a panel on this election season, have him doing a webinar?" And he's like, "Who you should really talk to is Joshua Butler." And hey, that's why we're here. So, and I got a chance to read your book or listen to your book. I don't know what the right way to say that is. As I was driving around our district, the Party Crasher, and I just was like, "Wow, this will be a great conversation, fascinating conversation for those who are listening in on the webinar." I think you'll find some real practical tips as you think about the election season that's coming up, and we'll get to the sort of the nitty gritty of like how do we do this? How do we navigate when we're the title of this webinar is navigating election season. We'll get some practical steps to do that, but let's just first say, Joshua, I mean, how did you get into this whole topic of
Definitely.
political theology?
Yeah. Historically, I was always very fascinated with political theology. For years, when was 15 years as a local and global outreach pastor at a church in Portland, and found myself working predominantly in Vietnam, where the persecuted church had a very kind of hostile
Mm-hmm.
relationship. The government was hostile towards the church there, context of persecution, and in Cambodia, where churches were trying to minister to their communities, but in a context of a lot of corruption, financial corruption, bribery with kind of government agencies. And then in Portland, where we were trying to work with the local government, mayor's office, and had a lot of civic partnerships going on, but found myself going, okay, three very different contexts, but all of them, how do we as the church relate to both the government and kind of civic society around us? And so that really kind of propelled me into political theology just out of interest. How do we do this well? How do we know kind of big
Mm-hmm.
picture how the church has understood this? But then more particularly with the party crasher, a lot of it came out of the last two election cycles, the last two election seasons, where in 2020, one story that really impacted me was a friend of ours church, so a church in our network where, man, half the church disappeared in 2020 out of 3,000 people. 1,500 members left, and they left angry. And it was all because of something small. Like the lead pastor had posted an Instagram video online that seemed pretty tame. He was trying to kind of shepherd his people in response to the moment. And what he said was
Mm.
tame, but there was a small handful of 7 people at the church who heard it, kind of read it through a particular ideological grid, and then they left and sought to take down the church on their way out. They were angry. And so they started coffee shop conversations, email chains, like spreading misinformation and slander.
Mm.
They scoured sermons of every church there were 10 churches in our network. Every church in the network, they were scouring sermons, looking for ammo. They were looking at monitoring social media feeds of all the pastors and their spouses to look for ammunition. There was like a YouTube video they created that kind of went viral locally, saying the lead pastor was under the influence of Satan. And
Wow.
man, went to another church and got them to start a series against, our network, I guess it's true. And so it was crazy, and it worked. Tragically, it worked, and the church split in half, and so much of it was just misinformation, slander. But I wish I could say that this was a one-off event, but the reality is it's just felt to me, recently, like this is the new church split. Like I've talked to so many leaders nationally
Hmm.
who have
Yeah.
experienced the same things here in the Northwest. I was in Arizona for a season, talking to leaders around the country, and just so many are finding, man, this feels like the new church split, where churches are fracturing along political fault lines. And the major pressures that we're facing today seem not so much doctrinal as rather cultural. And obviously, we know it's not just dividing churches, but families and friendships are dividing and fracturing along these lines. And so that really, I think, propelled this question of how do we come together in a world that's coming apart?
Yeah.
Like today,
Yeah.
unity in the body of Christ. How do we maintain and preserve and pursue unity as the people of God in the midst of political difference, and still, yeah, being able to navigate that with maturity and
Yeah.
wisdom.
Well, like a dentist who hits the nerve accidentally. I think you've just hit some nerves, even just telling that
Yes.
story at that one church.
Yeah.
A couple of us are flinching inside, like, oh yeah, I know what that feels like, and
Yes.
which actually gets us to a little bit to our. I mean, we got some poll questions that we want to toss up on the end, on the front end here, just kind of get at this, because there is some like, hey, I don't even want to talk about this, or others who want to, but they don't know how. But a couple of questions of those of you who are chiming in here on this webinar, if you could answer them, that'd be helpful. It's like, how often does the church you lead or you're part of address political topics? And the second one is, how confident are you in guiding your congregation through an election year? So on the first one, it's just, hey, regularly, annually, only during election year, never. And maybe if you're answering never, maybe that's why you're paying attention in this webinar. And the confidence one, maybe that story that Josh just told you reminded you of you may have felt confident, but yeah, maybe this one strikes a little fear in your heart as you think about this upcoming election season. And even saying that I mean, for me, that's why I think this webinar is so important, because we want to we're not saying that we shouldn't engage at all politically, but we want to do it wisely, understanding that we are first citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Yet at the same time, we want to be good citizens in the country in which we live in. So I think this will be super helpful. So it looks like, as we're looking at some of those answers, that first question, that majority of people are addressing this only during election year, which yeah, I could totally understand that. And the second highest is never, and there's probably a story there. And in confidence level, 71% of those saying that, yeah, 3 out of 5. So looks like we're on the right track here, Josh. And there's a few more uh, who are still taking this. But that information is super helpful. Josh, when I was listening to your book, and I was kind of, yeah, there's the answers to the question. Kind of look at it there again.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Rich is throwing us up.
We,
Yeah. When I
great.
was listening to your book, I'm driving north on I-5 and doing that. You had a section in your book that very, very early. Obviously, you have an opening story, which is pretty engaging. about a friend, and then you start to lay the landscape of what I would say is the political landscape. And as you do that, you you did for me, like I had one of those moments where I pulled the car over the side of the road and started writing what you were saying down, because I think anytime someone could lay out the topography of the land that we're living in, or they can exegete culture well, it doesn't necessarily give you like, what do I do with it? um, it's kind of like the Sons of Issachar. We understand the times, and
Mhm.
we'll get to the know what to do. But it gave me incredible understanding. I think it'd be super helpful for those who are listening in to have you do that for us, just to kind of like lay out the political landscape like you do in your book. I think that'd be super helpful.
Great, definitely, yeah. So basically in the book, I talk about what I call the four political religions, trying to describe the lay of the land landscape, as you mentioned, Steve. And maybe for a thought experiment, when I talk about these as religions, I want to say, like, imagine you wake up tomorrow and a third of your church has converted to another religion, like some to Buddhism, some to Islam. Like one dude's now a Zoroastrian or something, but they're still in your church and they're sharing tenets of their newfound faith in coffee shops. They're posting their favorite mantras on Instagram and sharing, teachings from their new favorite guru on YouTube. But eventually, when you won't align with kind of their newfound passion, they eventually leave and go somewhere else. And I would suggest to you that this has actually happened, but we don't recognize it because they're not converting to the old school world religions, but to the new school political religions. And when I use that term political religion, you might kind of go like, well, hey, aren't those two separate categories? Politics is over here and religion is over here. But I'd suggest to you that, the root of the term religion had to do with devotion, like what you were devoted to, and the
Mm-hmm.
social bonds and expectations that came with that devotion. And I would argue that there's no greater devotion and zeal that many people are showing today than to their political ideology. And so I want to suggest it can be helpful if we think of these political quadrants I'm going to lay out as religions, these ideologies, as for some people they're taking on the character of like an ultimate devotion that competes with their ultimate allegiance to Jesus. And so uh, the four political religions, my friend Jim and I used these categories during the last election season to try and map the lay of the land, to try and help our church just navigate and kind of understand, give some categories to understand where we're at. And I want to say I'm using these categories descriptively, not prescriptively. We'll get
Mm-hmm.
later in this webinar into like, oh, where do we go from here? So I'm not trying to like poke fun or whatever, I'm just trying to give us, describe the lay of the land that we find ourselves in. Helpful, I think it'd be helpful to kind of go, okay, here's where we are. But here I'm going to try and share my screen here so I can share some slides as we walk through this. Um, okay, oops, lost the Zoom. So if I go share, do this. Okay, is that showing up?
Yep. Yep. Got it.
Great. Okay. So we're talking about the four political religions. And here's the gist, right? Is that we tend to think of politics as left versus right. And that's true. But what we can miss is that there is also a top-down axis of modernity to post-modernity that has split the traditional political divide, I would suggest, in ways that help explain why some of the deepest fighting that we see today is not just left versus right, but it's also different factions on the left and different factions on the right. Um, and so I want to walk through these four quadrants that this creates. And again, trying to describe these as the political religions, I would suggest, can help make sense of where we're at today. So first, if we start in the upper left, this is the modern left. And here I call this the religion of progress, whose creed is we can change the world. Here there is a faith in things like scientific discovery, technological advancement, strong institutions, higher education, research, and public policy. This religion is most prominent in places like Silicon Valley. And so you can think here of things like Google and Facebook, of the smartphone and the tech boom, of artificial intelligence and medical breakthroughs. High priests for this religion would be figures historically like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. We can think of institutions like the Clinton Foundation. The worship leader for this quadrant is uncontestably Bono, right? Like I love Bono from U2. He's great. But he's guiding the masses to uplift the masses and singing these hymns that unite and uplift humanity.
Yeah.
Apologists for this quadrant would be figures like Steven Pinker and Sam Harris, for those who are
Mm,
familiar with them, who are defending the ascendance of our civilization through science and reason.
mm,
Sacred texts in this quadrant can be found in places like CNN, the New York Times, NPR, and maybe for the more radical fundamentalists, Mother Jones, right? And
mm,
the sermons for this quadrant, this religion, are TED Talks. Its scripture
mm,
is academic research. Its temple is arguably the university, and especially the STEM department, like science, technology, engineering, mathematics. This is where the laity can kind of rise and ascend the ranks of the priesthood, learning how to mediate the transcendent truths of this religion of progress to the world. And zealous laity in this religion can be found waiting 8 hours in line at the Apple Store for the latest update to that sacred amulet, the iPhone, right?
the sacred
Which,
amulet. Love it.
yes, well, totally, which promises to give you access to omniscience, being able to know everything that's
Mm,
going on in the world, omnipresence, being able to be present from people around the globe, and omnipotence with the power of the universe, or at least of the internet in the palm of your hand. Okay, so that is called the religion of progress, the modern left.
mhm,
But now let's go to the modern right. And this is what I call the religion of responsibility, whose creed here is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So in this religion, there's a strong faith in personal potential, in hard work, and good moral values, in individual liberty. This religion is most prominent in the suburbs. And we can think here of things like Wall Street, classic conservatism, of the free market and business entrepreneurship. The high priest for this quadrant was historically Ronald Reagan, with Milton Friedman as its greatest economic apologist and Newt Gingrich its public herald. But today, I would suggest the baton has been passed to figures like Jordan Peterson, who says if you want to
mm,
change the world, you start by making your own bed, right? You take responsibility
mhm,
for yourself. Or figures like Jocko Willink and David Goggins, if anyone's familiar with these guys, that they guide novices into the virtues and values of extreme ownership. Don't just take ownership, take extreme ownership, extreme responsibility for yourself and what you have under your sphere of control. Sacred texts for this religion can be found in Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, and the Daily Wire. Its scripture is the stock market, updated for hourly observances and meditation. And its temple is arguably the house with the white picket fence and the two-car garage, right? Like a
mm,
reward for the faithful who've lived out their family values and responsibility to their community. Now, when I was growing up, this felt like kind of the world, right? The divide, these two sides. But in order to move now to the bottom two quadrants, we first have to talk about, well, what is modernity and postmodernity? And any philosophy majors in the room here are going to want to slap me for how simplistic I'm about to be. But I'll take that slap over everyone else in this webinar falling asleep, right? So if we first talk about modernity, it's just a visual stereotype that my friend Jim Mullins uses for this is a scientist in a lab coat doing experiments, right? And so he's got the lab coat and the microscope. And this image speaks to the values of modernity and the Enlightenment, which had a strong faith in reason and the scientific method in building strong institutions. And there was a sense that we can solve the world's problems through these things. It was very optimistic about human potential to use these things to fix the world. Um, but if we go to postmodernity, postmodernity was in many ways a reactionary movement that saw modernity's failures. Things like world wars, nuclear weapons, evil things like eugenics that were done in the name of science and progress. And so a visual stereotype for postmodernity, I suggest, could be an artist painting a picture of, drumroll please, themselves as the artist, right? Where here there's a strong emphasis on creative self-expression, where if modernity was about discovering and defining the world, postmodernity is about constructing and creating one's own world. And so let's talk then about these lower quadrants, right? So just the lower left, or the postmodern left, is what I call the religion of identity. And here its creed is live your truth. This religion is most prominent in the urban core. Um, think of places like San Francisco and Boston. Think of race and gender yard signs that surround my home here in, in Northeast Portland, where we've lived this last year. We can think here of figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Elliot Page, protests against the legacy of injustice, TikTok and Instagram posts with an ethos of self-expression. And this religion, or this, this quadrant, because it's in the postmodern realm, it's pessimistic towards the ideas and institutions of modernity. So there's still a desire for progress, but there's a sense that we can no longer trust those things out there to get us there. We have to now look in here, like within ourselves. And so there's an emphasis on internally discovering and expressing one's most authentic desires. So preachers for this quadrant are pop icons like Lady Gaga, Little Nas X, who model the way of salvation through performative self-expression and continual reinvention. Prophets in this quadrant, political leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who proclaim the gospel that the world will be saved through deconstructing and dismantling all institutional roadblocks that keep people from being their most authentic selves. Sacred texts in this religion can be found in TikTok and Instagram, where influencers provide you a menu of options to build your identity like a brand. And the temple for this quadrant is the protest, where the Vox Populi, or voice of the people, can register their disillusionment with the establishment and demand change. Its catechism, I would suggest, is the Disney script. I love Disney movies. I watch them with my kids, so I'm not ragging on Disney here. But there is a sense when you look at the movies that my kids have kind of grown up with, a lot of them have had this theme where the family, tradition, authority are all these obstacles to the person, the hero figure, becoming their true authentic self. And so Elsa has to kind of let it go. There's no right or wrong rules for me. I'm free. Let all that stuff go and get away to the mountain and express who you really are. Or I am Moana, like you get away from your family, get away from all that, have the adventure where you discover and express who you are to the world. Um, this quadrant, this religion likes to think of itself, I found, as not being consumeristic. We're not consumeristic, we're minimalist, right? That was my wife and I. We used to always say, like, hey, we're not into stuff, we're into experiences. Without what we didn't realize at the time was like, oh man, that was just a new form of consumerism, right? There is sort of the new consumerism today where we've gone from buying stuff to doing stuff. We want the amazing meals at the hot new restaurants, the awesome vacations in these killer locations. We want the pour over coffee and the great microbrew and the concert festivals and all. We've gone from buying things to doing things. And the mark of having made it today is no longer kind of the logo or insignia on your jacket or handbag, but rather the location of your latest social media post. Right? Okay, so there, lower left. And now let's move to the postmodern right, the lower right. And again, with all these, we're not trying to be critical here. We're just trying to describe the lay of the land. We'll get to kind of prescriptive where do we go in a minute. But okay, so we get to the lower right, the postmodern right. I call this the religion of security, whose creed is good fences make good neighbors. And so here, this religion, the sense is, man, we live in a dangerous world. We need boundaries and borders to keep people safe. Security allows us to prosper. Insiders share codes of conduct or rules of behavior for how we live together. We should display thick bonds of loyalty to insiders, and we should be wary of outsiders who could threaten our way of life. And so this religion is most prominent in the heartland, left behind left behind from the coastal economic booms. So you can think here of things like hometown identity and jobs shipped overseas, of Detroit and the decline of manufacturing, of Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, of Appalachia and epidemic of meth addiction and unemployment. Now, again, being postmodern, this quadrant is pessimistic towards the institutions of modernity. So you'll hear a lot of the rhetoric of the deep state government wants to take away your rights. Big pharma medicine is pushing its pills and its vaccines on you. The fake news media is out to deceive you. The elites are out to get you. We need to stand up against those things. The sacred texts in this quadrant can be found in places like Fox News, Newsmax, Truth Social, and Breitbart. The high priest for this quadrant is, whether you love him or hate him, Donald Trump, right? Like when we think of his most viral campaign slogans, we can see how they tap into the values of this quadrant. So build the wall speaks to a desire for security in the context of borders and immigration. Drain the Swamp speaks to a deep suspicion of elites and institutions. Make America Great Again speaks to a patriotic nationalism in the face of globalization. Maybe we should revamp that here for Make the Alliance Great Again. Alliance for what?
Repurpose those hats.
Repurpose those hats, that's right. But each of those slogans speaks to a loyalty to us first, for those who are experiencing or perceiving a loss of jobs, of safety, of cultural cohesion, and national identity. And I think this mindset is prominent not just in the heartland, as a friend of mine pointed out. He's like, man, I feel like I grew up as well seeing this mindset in like 90s hip hop culture that he grew up in, where he said, the message was, dude, the streets are dangerous, the police are out to get you, society doesn't understand you, we need to stick together, our safety's at stake. There was a loyalty, not so much to a sacred code out there, but to insiders in here, where there were patriotic signs of identification like gang colors, tattoos that marked one as an insider, and where the cardinal sin was being a narc, a snitch, or a traitor, betraying one's crew. The point being that I think this quadrant, like all of them, is tapping into some values that are kind of universal or have broader appeal in humanity at large. And the temple for this religion, I would suggest, is the nation itself, where there are heretics who need to be shamed and called back to the ancient paths. There are corrupt leaders who need to be overthrown for defiling the sanctuary in DC. And there are hostile invaders at the gate who need to be repelled with stronger enforcement of our sacred borders. Okay, so we kind of walk through those four quadrants. Again, we're just trying to kind of map lay of the land and all, but this gives rise to the question, which quadrant does Jesus belong in, right? Like, ding, 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 the $1 million question. And the reality is Jesus doesn't belong to these values. These values belong to Jesus. I would suggest that each of these values has something good to bring to the table. We see all four of these values, progress, responsibility, identity, and security. We see them in the Garden of Eden, and we see them in the kingdom of God in the biblical story. And yet each has a danger when they become uprooted from God's creational design, when they become exalted over God himself. They can become like an idol that gives rise to an idolatrous ideology. And so how do we stay united as the church? How do we come together in a world that's coming apart? Well, I suggest that what the gospel calls us to is we need to bring your lean, but submit your bow, right? That we bring our lean, our political leaning, but we submit our bow to Jesus. That your leaning is your perspective, shaped by your experience, your political leaning, your perspective on civic engagement. All this is shaped by our experience, but your bow is your ultimate allegiance, where your ultimate allegiance lies. And I find it powerful that Jesus invites disciples with different political leanings, right? Like, think about it. He invites blue-collar fishermen and white-collar doctors. He calls zealots who want to overthrow the empire, and he calls tax collectors who are trying to maintain the status quo. And we can miss how revolutionary that was, right? Like, these groups wanted to kill each other back in the day. It's like Jesus is inviting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ben Shapiro into a small group and going, you guys got to get along because you've got me in common. But this is intentional on Jesus' part, right? Like, because it's not like Jesus is going, oh my gosh, how does zealot get in here? Or how did tax collector get in? Like, no, Jesus is intentionally calling these disciples with different political leanings because his goal is a reconciled community. That Jesus didn't just die so we could hang out with our buddies. He died to reconcile Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female, and Democrat and Republican. Right? Like, and so the call to bring our lean but submit our bow, I think it's helpful. We think of Jesus's table, just setting a common table in a conflicted world at the center of this diagram. And now by putting it at the center, I don't mean that the goal is to become as centrist as possible or just try and take the middle road every time. Talk more in the book about, man, that actually becoming a disciple of Jesus may put you further into your particular quadrant, but you're going to be a better disciple of Jesus there. So the goal is not saying you need to be centrist or apolitical, but the goal is saying that our discipleship to Jesus will actually form and shape our posture in a way that can maintain and preserve our unity, can keep us united, even in the different places that we're in the midst of this conflicted world. And so I would suggest, I'm going to exit the share mode now and go back to here. Yeah, but so I believe that, the bring your lean, submit your bow, we need in the church, we need people with different political leanings, right? We need people who lean
Mhm.
progress to remind us that God's story starts in a garden and ends in a city, and God invites us to partner with him in cultivating creation to get it there, right? We need people who lean responsibility to remind us that God cares about righteousness and uprightness and how we steward what he's given for our families and communities and all. We need people who lean identity to remind us that we were created in the image of God with dignity, value, and worth, and that we were loved by God so much that he would send his son, he would go to the cross to give his life for us. And we need people who lean security to remind us that God is a defender who defends particularly the
Mhm.
vulnerable and cares about establishing peace and security for his people. On the same hand, though, we also need to submit our bow. Like, it's important that we don't give into the idols, right? Like, um, there's a danger when you bow. Like, when you bow to the progress quadrant, you can miss how, like, the rise of social media, for example, has contributed, as so much of the research seems to be showing now, to the spikes in youth anxiety and depression these days. When you bow to the quadrant of responsibility, you can miss how all is grace, that the greatest things we have are undeserved. And there's a temptation to look down upon those who might be struggling, or if they just worked harder, if they just did whatever, versus realizing, man, the greatest thing we've all received is grace, where we were irresponsible. We didn't do things right. When you bow to the religion of identity, you can miss the deconstruction of male and female as good gifts that God has given for the flourishing of his world, and how that's happening today. When you bow to the religion of security, you can miss how there can cultivate a fear of those who are different from you, that even in some extreme cases can lead to violence and all, right? And so,
Mhm.
uh, and I would suggest the biggest sign that your lean has become a bow, or the biggest sign as we're seeking to lead our churches and people, the biggest sign that someone's lean has become a bow is their quickness to break fellowship with people who disagree with them, right? The
Yeah.
quickness to leave the common table of disciples. Um, yeah, because of that, there can be a tendency to be listening to pundits for many of our people today more than scripture and the voice of Christ, to become suspicious very quickly and immediately of people who don't kind of toe the party line or say a word that kind of sets them off, that kind of thing. And so I believe that Jesus, he confronts the bow, but fulfills the lean, that
Mm-hmm.
he in him is the greatest fulfillment of our desire for progress, like more than any medicine or technology, or he brings resurrection, like the cure and the peace we ultimately will fix our world and set it right. He is the one who took responsibility for us when we were irresponsible and didn't do things right for ourselves. He's the one who calls us into our truest identity as children of the Father and brings us into life with God. He's the one who establishes the security of God's kingdom for eternity and the peace that comes with that. And so I wrap all that up, by saying that the hope in this vision is actually that, uh, man, by pursuing and pressing into Jesus, that as the church we could stay united in a world that's coming apart.
Yeah. And I think too that what you just said there, hey, if I have to separate, leave the table, that being a like you're bowing. Boy, just go back in time and the stories you told at the beginning and how often that happens. And we'll get into because this is the lay of the land, which I think you've done so well for us. Then it gets into kind of like, oh, okay, so yeah, how do I make sure that I mean I'll have a lean, and I can identify the lean. How do I protect my own heart, my own allegiance to Jesus, and not let that become an idol to which I bow? There's probably some practical steps to that I know we're going to speak to. But before we do that, um, I I think it'd be good for us just to kind of respond to this and think about. Rachel's going to throw some questions up on poll wise because I think it's important for us to think about those we pastor and the churches in which we lead. Which quadrant? One question is, which quadrant do people in your church most lean towards? You think about progress, responsibility on the kind of upper modern. If you drop down to postmodern, you get to identity and security. if you think about those that you are, you know, pastoring, shepherding, the kind of some of the conversations that you're having, yeah, where do you think people fall? Second question is, um, which quadrant, if you think about your church and the conversations you're having, which quadrant do you think they struggle the most with? It usually comes up with, you know, maybe some conversations about conflict or some angst about where culture, the trajectory of culture. Um, that would be a great one to kind of respond to. And then, yeah, how about you? Which one of the four quadrants do you personally lean to? I think it's a really important one to process, because you're mashing up kind of where your own heart goes, and understand that maybe the people you're leading aren't thinking like you, and the lowest level of thinking is to think that everyone thinks like you. And so it's just understanding and almost exegeting your own culture in your own church would be super helpful. So if you can respond to those questions, I'll give you a few moments to do that. Some of you are doing that, and the more of us, the better. Just a reminder that you can also ask your own questions in the Q&A that we're going to try and get to towards the end. But maybe even as that's happening, I think there's one question in the Q&A, Joshua, by Jesse, as people are taking this poll that's asked. This might be a good time to try and answer it.
Yeah,
Jesse
great.
Holcomb is asking, are we at all approaching a point where modern left and right see their postmodern brothers as harmful to their own movements, and eventually form some sort of coalition? And the statement is made, it feels like we're on the edge of some sort of political shift, meaning left
Yeah.
and right at the top quadrants. Do we ever see those folks wanting to come together? And is it, do you see it still staying left and right, or could it be a modern postmodern shift, if that question
Great.
makes sense to you?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah. So maybe I'll come at it from a maybe sideways angle. One of the things I've processed a bit too is how big is each quadrant? Yeah. Some people have asked, like, are they all, on the graph, they're kind of all nice and the same size and all that. But my sense has been, I think if you go online, the bottom two quadrants are really big, right? Like identity and
Mm.
security feel really, really large, and the top two seem pretty small. But when you get offline and in conversations with everyday real people, like the top two, responsibility and progress, seem really big, and identity and security seem really small. It's been my experience, at
Mm.
least, and I think there's a logic to that. I think there are dynamics online that fuel kind of the postmodern ethos, the deconstructive kind of suspicion of, a variety of factors that I think lead to the postmodern impulse being really strong online. And I think you see that reflected in a lot of surveys and studies that show that a lot of online discourse reflects like it's driven by the less than 10% of the most extreme on the left and on the right, right? And then you have what sociologists would call like the silent majority, 80% or so, who are very disillusioned with how polarized and extreme and crazy it feels like everything has become, but don't want to step into the fray online because they don't want to get pounced upon and torn apart. And yet, I think are much more that way. But I do think it's interesting, related questions. Some folks have asked, where do you see figures like, you know, they used to call them like the intellectual dark web, or either like a Joe Rogan or some of the Sam Harris or Christina Hoff Sommers or Andrew Sullivan. There are a number of figures who are across the left-right spectrum and yet have kind of a common cause. And to your point in the question, I tend to think of it as like high modernity. That there are a lot of figures emerging with a lot of traction and popularity online who are kind of speaking out. Who are more kind of that high modern, calling for, sometimes the language you see there is more liberalism versus illiberalism.
Mm.
So liberalism being like high modernity, quote, hey, commitment to let's have a good conversation and talk together and explore all these different ideological viewpoints, versus illiberalism, which would be kind of the cancel culture type motif on both the left and right. Let's just shout down anyone who says anything that feels threatening to our particular viewpoint. And so I do think you're seeing like a frustration with some of the postmodern ethos on both the left and the right,
Mm-hmm.
and certain quarters that are kind of rallying to sort of a high liberalism or liberalism or high modernity. But I think it's an open question in my mind, how much traction can that actually get in a world that is so driven by some of the online postmodern ethos? So I don't know. I
Mm.
don't know the answer, but it's a really interesting question.
Well, I do think it's fascinating that yeah, the volume tends to be that postmodern left and right, but yeah, that actually more people when you get offline or up in those upper two quadrants is fascinating. Hey,
Totally.
let's throw those the results of the survey up. Get a feel for this. So, which quadrant looks like the largest quadrant is in the responsibility, and it's kind of your guess as well as second highest being security. Um, I get I'm not surprised by the identity one. I don't know if you are, Josh, or not, but most people are not in that quadrant. And if you go to second question, which one they have the hardest time with, it's identity, 86%.
Yeah.
And in fact, just as we're right there, just um, James has asked a question about deconstructing gender as something. Is it? I need you to clarify or explain it somehow. Deconstructing gender is something good. I just want to just speak to that, James. That's not what Joshua said. It actually says that the image of God and God's plan is that actually we're flourishing when genders are retained as He is designed. So maybe
Oh,
misheard what
yeah.
Joshua was saying, but he was not saying that. And your other question about leaning in, mean compromise, and no, it's not a compromise. It's just understanding that your personal values cause you to lean a certain way, and so it's important to understand that where you're at in your own lean, because as Josh has done so well, is at Jesus' table. If you think about the design of the garden, there was responsibility given, right? And it's tending to the garden, which means progress. Those are good things in the garden. Identity, made in the image of God, that's beautiful. Security, yeah, protected. He's our shield. These are all, when you look through the biblical lens, yeah, gorgeous. But like anything,
Totally.
the enemy can distort and twist, and he's the expert at it. And so sometimes even our own thinking has to be recalibrated with Scripture and the overall narrative of what Scripture has to say. Because in any of these, when we start bowing to a quadrant, we actually we've got our own sacred text that we'll kind of extract out of the sacred text to defend our opinions. So I
Yeah.
just
Oh,
find that's all
definitely. Yeah.
fascinating.
And if I could, piggyback on that too, Steve, thank you. And apologize if did not speak clearly earlier. On the first question or comment. Yeah, what I was trying to say was that I think in the identity quadrant danger is like the identity quadrant is often leading in the deconstruction of male and female as
Yeah.
God's good gifts for creation. And I'm here in Portland, and I see some followers of Jesus who are so immersed in kind of the identity quadrant and that ethos. The danger is they miss, dude. That's a danger. Like, dude, if you're
Yeah.
bowing to that deconstruction of male and female is a danger, because that's actually a good gift that God's given us, not
Yeah.
an oppressive whatever, the gift of the body. And on the second one too, yeah, that leaning, not as compromising. It's being able to, in some ways, I've grown more in my convictions, by being in life with people who see the world differently, because we get to hash it out, and rather
Hmm.
than just distancing from them. But there's a great quote there's a sociologist, Bill Bishop, who wrote a book called The Big Sort a while back about how Americans are sorting themselves more and more into kind of isolated echo chambers where they're only surrounded by people who see the world the same way that we
Hmm.
do. And his observation in the studies and research on it is that it says mixed company moderates, a homogeneous company pushes you to the extremes. And
Hmm.
saying that, like, mixed company, when you're with people who lean differently and you can process, it actually humanizes, kind of other perspectives. It challenges your own views in a way that your own views become more nuanced and all. But if we only surround ourselves with people who see the world the same way we do, then it tends to reinforce, it pushes us to the extreme, and it tends to reinforce some of the worst caricatures of other people, and dehumanizing all.
Yeah.
So the point being, I think bringing your lean means it's not saying, hey, just compromise and let go of your convictions, but it's saying being able to stay at the table together with people who lean in different directions is actually going to, in some ways, I know it has for me, it's deepened some of my convictions.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
it's good. I mean,
rather
and
than
I think,
compromise them.
and that's the danger of cancel culture because I mean, you got to. I mean, that's where wisdom comes from. That's where understanding comes from. Being around people who think a little bit differently. It's iron sharpening iron. If it's Christian context. But I got surrounded by people in my own neighborhood who don't know Jesus, and I love talking to them, get their understanding and their thinking on things, and I want them to hear my thinking. It's kind of listening to the point of understanding. That's just good missiological wisdom when you're out and about in the world. Um, so yeah, I love those conversations. I love to hear what people are thinking. I love to hear the Holy Spirit give a little nudge about, hey, when do I have this conversation? And frankly, I love having those conversations in the church as well, because I do think we need a reframing of maybe of how we're approaching things. I think it could be wise and to do so. Hey, just back to the poll. The last question: which of the four quadrants do you lean towards? Those of you who are participating in the webinar, pretty good mix here. Highest responsibility, 45%. Then we get to progress as 25%. Identity, 18%, and lowest one was security. And so, man, thanks for answering those questions, everybody. That's super helpful. That creates some of its own challenges when you come to navigating the election season. And one of the things that I think may be helpful for you to know is Joshua's been preaching through the different four quadrants at his church, just saying, "Hey, let's just talk about the progress." But he's laid it all out, and then he's hitting each one. And I'm not suggesting that's what you should do. I'm just saying that's what he's doing, and I think it actually helps people understand. Yeah, where are we as a people? Where am I? And how do I stay at the table? And I think that's where it leads actually, Joshua, to this next set of questions because
Well,
I,
yeah.
yeah,
So
jump
you
in.
just mentioned that, Steve. Maybe I just jump in really quick too. Yeah, and actually one thing that I've done in a lot of places that if it's helpful, I'm happy to share my notes, and people can take them and use anything that's helpful there. But often for a one-off sermon, I've done a message on Ephesians 2 and been able to talk about unity and then kind of the four
Mm,
quadrants in the mix of that. But honestly, if anyone's interested, I can send those to Rachel too, and she can share those with anyone that might
perfect.
want anything there
Yeah,
that could be a resource.
no, that's awesome. And so it kind of translates into this next part is because I know when I think about discipleship, when I was being discipled and I was growing up, political discipleship just didn't even hit the radar, right? And we're learning that we've got to understand how to understand the times, but then know what to do. So whether it becomes we're discipleship in our sexuality, there needs to be discipleship in political thinking. So here we are. We're looking to you, buddy. You're going to solve all our problems now. Lay us out. How do we practically do this?
Yes.
Now that you've laid this out, what are some key points of wisdom that you would give to us?
I don't know. Like, no, obviously, multifaceted question, and just want to share some resources, some thoughts that have been most helpful in our context. So taking it as helpful, ditch the rest. But I'd say a few major things here. The first, and maybe I'll share some slides again here too to go with this. Where did it go? Here we go. Why is it not? Sorry, one second. It's not.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who does this. But I
I'll share this and then pull this up. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the first one I would suggest is to prep your posture, whether for you or for your people. And here, one resource I want to draw your attention to is a Christian political commitment. This is something that me and our leadership team at the former church where I was pastoring in 2020, we pulled these together to create what we called the 10 political commandments, this Christian political commandment. We jokingly referred to them as the 10 political commandments because we didn't want them to get confused with the actual 10 commandments that God gives Moses on Mount Sinai, but also not joking in the sense of, I believe these are things that God commands his people, us as his people in scripture, that God says, hey, this is how I want you to live your life. Now, this political commitment, this is not about how to vote per se, or like what opinions to hold. It's rather about how to hold those opinions well. It's about our posture as we enter in. And these are not, I think some people can kind of go, oh, well, that's nice in your private spiritual life, but not out here in the political real world. It's like, no, these are things God commands us and that the early church was called to and committed to in the midst of civic life, and we should be as well. So to give a feel for a flavor, even just a few of these, the first one was, is I commit my allegiance to King Jesus over all idols and ideologies. Because, man, there are
Mm-hmm.
people spending billions of dollars right now trying to pull our allegiance in different directions. But dude, worship is a political act. It orients our lives around God as the true center of our world, and it puts in perspective. It's like, yeah, we're going to vote, vote a certain way, or believe more in this leader than that leader, and whatever else. But all that's kind of framed under a higher commitment to God at the center of our world, and believing Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that's going to, I think, do a number of things for our peace in the midst of political storms and turmoil and all, and for our character. Even, if our side wins, we can be stoked, but not have to gloat and try and rub it in. And if our side loses, we can like be sad, but like it's not the end of the world, like because we know that Christ is still ruling and reigning. So worship's the first one. Second one, love of neighbor. I commit to participating in civic life as a means of loving and serving my neighbor rather than just serving my own interests. Going, this can lead us to different policies, different postures, different places on the political landscape. But as terms of motive, we want our heart to be actually, God, how do I love my neighbor through my vote, through my participation in civic life, right? Um, Again, this is a free resource that you can download on my website if anyone's interested, or Rachel can send this out as well afterwards. But to give a few maybe examples from some other ones, I'll stop sharing here and go back. There was other of the commitments here. One's on biblical wisdom. Going, I commit to having my views challenged by the biblical story rather than using the Bible to prove text my predetermined positions, right?
Mm-hmm.
See, I think there's a danger in the four quadrants that each quadrant can kind of cherry pick the verses that it likes more, the kind of parts of scripture it likes more. And so if you're in the uh, progress quadrant, we tend to really like Genesis 1 and 2. It's all about like the creation mandate, and we're given this to cultivate creation and make things better and do all that, but we can maybe be a little soft on Genesis 3 and sin and the fall, right? If you lean into the responsibility quadrant, we're maybe really big on the Proverbs and the epistles, which can feel a little more clear cut, like here's how to live responsibly and
Mm-hmm.
take, live the right way and do things for your life. But maybe a little slower sometimes on things like the prophets, for example, who are calling out injustice, corporate levels in the people of God, and so on. If you lean to the identity quadrant, you might be really big on like the prophets and that kind of stuff, but slower on Jesus' call that those who, to lay down your life and to be crucified to your own desires and your own self to follow Christ and his way of life and his kingdom. And the security quadrant can really love kind of like the apocalyptic kind of passages, that sort of thing, but be slow on some of these other areas that we've mentioned elsewhere. So all that to say, we need the whole biblical story,
Mm-hmm.
not just cherry picking different parts of it. Um, Talk about fruitful speech is one of them. That I commit to engaging in political discourse with speech that's marked by the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Going like, man, we can communicate our positions, but how would it change the game if the way that we communicated online and in person was actually marked by fruitful speech, like the
Yeah.
fruit of the Spirit, and how we talk with one another? um, Peacemaking. I have two chapters in the book, kind of walk more in depth on each of these. Removing the log. I commit to giving more attention to examining the potential flaws in my own political leanings, conduct, and sin than I give to scrutinizing others. So Jesus talks about, taking the log out of our own eyes so that we can see clearly to help our brother with the speck in his. And I think this confronts one tendency I've seen in, for us as churches, and what I call fake boldness in the book, where there's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
tendency to like think we're really bold calling out some, the idols in the church across town, and so you see this, I think, even online. Some pastors are planting the flag on a particular political quadrant and calling out idols in other quadrants. And so this is, in Arizona, I saw this where it was kind of the more affluent white mega church in the suburbs outside of town where all they wanted to talk about was the dangers of like woke CRT, just a crowd. And then you had kind of like the hip, young, urban, hipster, whatever church in the urban core that all they wanted to talk about was the dangers of Christian nationalism. And, and just kind of going, I don't think either of those camps have those people in their congregation, but that's the thing, like, and it's just going, and they would act like, oh, I'm being so bold and courageous calling out this stuff, but it was like stuff that wasn't actually an issue in their congregation, in their church body,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think as leaders, we need to help sensitively and wisely and certainly, but help to pastorally address what are some of the challenges within our own uh, church's leanings, and that's going to take some courage. It's a lot easier to just throw stones at the folks over there, but to actually look at, okay, what are some of the dynamics or trends in our own congregation, in our own church, and how do we pastorally address those well? Humble learning is one. And then finally, the 10th is loving enemies. I commit to loving and praying for my so-called political enemies, especially those I have the hardest time loving and praying for. This includes a commitment to praying for our government leaders, regardless of who wins the election. So all I have to say, I think the big picture here is how do we prepare our posture as leaders and
Mm-hmm.
help shepherd our people to prepare their posture as we're stepping into election season to put Christ first and to bring their lean, but to submit their bow. Sorry, I've got this new office with this timed light that just goes off at the most appropriate times. Okay. All right. So let's go to the second one. I'd say the second theme here is to go local. Here again, to go local. And what I mean by that is, there's a big uh, push a lot of times to, man, so much emphasis on the national. How are you going to vote? You're going to vote for president, that kind of thing. And I'm saying, yeah, vote nationally, but work locally. One of the things we did in the last election season, 2020, was we started what we called prayer and action groups and called our people saying, hey, if you're really feeling compelled to get, very active online and whatnot, what if you took a lot of that energy and actually we got involved here locally in our city, in our community? So we started two prayer and action groups, the one on sanctity of life and one on criminal justice, knowing that those were two issues that tended to resonate with different sides of the political aisle. And the commitment that people made as they stepped in, there were about 15 people in each group. And the commitment was, I'm going to commit to a year of praying together around this issue, to listening and learning from local leaders in our community and our city who are leading the way on this issue, and to reading up on the best resources on this issue, and to finding one concrete form of action that we as a group can lead our church in taking to actually make a constructive difference impact in our city on this issue. And one of the things that was crazy was these groups found, both groups found, man, so much of what they all agreed was actually most effective in our city was not what they would have been led to believe by just the national sound bites and narrative. And that there was action that was really constructive they were able to jump into and lead us as a church in. And one of the reasons we call this prayer in action too was because our moment tends to pull these things apart. You have when ethical issues where stuff comes up, you have the one side who's like, okay, I'll pray for it, but we don't actually pray. And then you have the other side who's like, spare us your prayers, like we need action, and go, no, we need both of these. Like we need prayer. We have access to the God of the universe. What greater resource is there than that? The God who can move mountains and shake and move things in our community. And also we want to be constructively involved, like that yeast Jesus talks about in the dough, or the seed of the kingdom that grows to become a giant tree.
Yeah.
Like even our small actions locally can have a growing monumental impact over the long haul, with God's blessing. So we want to go local. The third, actually, I'm going to go fourth here. So another one here is watching your filter and helping our people to watch their filter, right? And by filter, I mean that there are so many things that people are hearing through their particular ideological grid, their filter, that can distort what they're hearing. So back in the last election season, where we had this guy show up at our church, and he was like, "Why do you guys have these All Lives Matter signs all over your church campus?" And I was like, what all lives matter sign? What is he talking about? You know, and he's like, no, you guys have these posters, these billboards, all lives matter all over your church. And I'm offended. You know, I'm like, okay, well, can you show it? I'm thinking, man, did we get like graffitied or did somebody spray paint, you know, our building? Like, what's going on here? Can you show us these signs? And so he takes us out, and sure enough, all over our campus, you know, the vision statement for over 10 years was all of life is all for Jesus. All of life is all for Jesus. And so he was seeing that, but through his filter, through his ideological grid, he was hearing all lives
Mm,
matter, you know, like some political statement. And what I say is his filter, his ideological grid was distorting. He was hearing things we weren't actually saying because of that.
yep.
And we had similarly, there was this woman who, you know, is like 2 weeks later, one of our pastors was preaching on progressive sanctification. The idea, you know, you don't become holy overnight. It's you're sanctified, it's gradual over time, it's progressive. And he clarified very clearly, you know, what he meant by the term in the message. But afterwards, there was this irate woman afterwards who was like so angry. Why are you saying that if I'm being sanctified, I'm going to be becoming more progressive? You know, and so like, dude, I guess she had a filter and she was hearing things that weren't actually being said. And now those are extreme examples, but I think we all, in those, you know, as pastors here, you know, as leaders, I'm sure you've all seen that where people hear things that
Oh,
you're not
100%.
actually saying. And even, man, I just had a sermon last week where I like preparing, you know, I just go, man, there are so many landmines. Like there are whatever word that just has associations that I don't intend, and this crowd's going to hear this, you know? And so I know that can feel intimidating. I think calling our people, just calling that out and naming it, you know, with our people to
Mm,
watch their filter. But also, I think, how do we address that pastorally? I found the power of listening. One of the things I counseled our pastoral team last time was like, dude, I think most people just want to feel heard. And sure
mm,
enough, I found if we could get on the phone or in person and just ask good questions and hear them out, after 15, 20 minutes, like the tension just de-escalated. And I was often like, oh yeah, we didn't say that, or that's not what we meant, or no, we're not doing that, you know? And so one of the things we did last season that was really helpful was one of an idea to consider is we've created 15-minute Calendly appointments. So Calendly is like an online calendar, and we just had spots with a pastor where we encourage our people, hey, if you have a question or something we said or something you've heard, you're just kind of confused about or you're concerned about regarding politics or regarding whatever, you know, um, go online, take a 15-minute work break, set up an appointment and talk to one of us as a pastor, and we can process that with you. And what I found was um, not that many people actually used it. It didn't take that much time, but you heard so many people in our church talking about it. Hey,
mm.
did you know we've got these calendars? Like our pastors want to hear what we're, you know, and even having that as a resource, the culture, you know, cultivating a culture where people felt like, okay, if I do have a concern, I'm not going to get brushed off. I want to be heard. Like it just de-escalated things a lot. And so I think trying to create those environments where within the church where people are aware, hey, we've all got our filters. Let's actually process through those together. Inviting that can be helpful. Steve, trying to remember time wise. Are we doing okay?
Yeah, we're shooting for an hour, but we'll be an hour five. So
Cool.
yeah, if you hit
Well,
hit the last ones there, and then we
yeah,
can. I got one question I want to fire your way.
great. I'll go
I mean,
kind
we're
of
not we're
quick.
not
Yeah,
where's Grace here?
great.
We're
Cool.
preachers used to going over.
Great. I'll go quick on these last two. One is just practicing formation. In the book, I have a whole chapter on how looking at some of our traditional, you know, spiritual formation practices, how they're designed to shape us politically. So reading scripture, being in the word, you know, how that's actually a political act. It's designed to shape us as citizens because we're, you know, the four quadrants are all telling a particular story about the world, but immersing ourselves in God's story for the world confronts those. Being in community, small groups, connection, and standing at the table with people who see the world differently, like that actually is a designed to form you by being in life with people who see the world differently from you.
Yep.
By reality, I mean things like we called our people last year to take a 40-day social media fast. We're doing some similar this year, social media fast leading up to the election. And people loved it. It was so good. But some people were like, hey, you're checking out of reality. And we're like, no, social media online, it's not reality. You know, there's algorithms with people spending billions of dollars to try and get your attention and pull you into these angry polar, you know, like in some ways it's checking into reality so that you can be healthy when you go back out. And
It's
everybody's already
so
made up their
true.
mind already for the election. You know, everyone's already made there. You're not going to convince anyone out there. And so why don't we spend that time actually praying for our country, praying for our church, praying for our leaders and all. Um, then the final one is just what I call break the box. The last chapter of the book, I give 6 creative options for political engagement, where I think many of us feel like there's only the donkey option, the elephant option, and the ostrich option. Bury your head in the sand and wait till it all blows over, you know? But actually going, there's a lot of other options from Christian history, going local or being like Daniel in political office or working like William Wilberforce on a long haul on one particular issue, going deep like a scuba diver or um, uh, be pouring into an alternative community in the midst of the society around us. There's a number of different creative options that I think all of us can find at least one for how we're going to engage civically in our life and helping our people break the boxes to have a bigger imagination for what our civic involvement can look like. Yeah.
Yeah, so good, man. So good. I love those. Prep your posture, watch your filter, I mean, the formation, break the box, the the statement you made about vote nationally, but get active locally is such a good one. Because yeah, if we could just mirror our energy, we're it's so easy to do things from behind a screen, right? Um,
Mhm.
I find that when I get the sting and the zing of an email, and then I meet with a person one on one, it's just the tone is so different when it's face to face.
Yes. Yes.
And so I just think there's such good wisdom there in what you've shared with us. What as kind of as we wrap up, just one question going back to that. Okay, 4 quadrants. You got the Jesus table. We're staying engaged. What would you say to someone who has attempted to stay engaged at Jesus table, and maybe they have a lean that others don't have, but tend to be demeaned, maybe devalued, maybe even hurt as they lean to the table? Is there a time to step away from the table? Is there? I mean, what would you? I mean, as a pastor now, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, no, definitely. No, I mean, I do think that I mean, there are issues of, I think like any conversation, right? Like you're staying at the table and you can have a church environment that just becomes abusive leadership or toxic, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or goes off, you know, is no longer biblical in terms of their doctrine or things like that. You know, like there does come a point at which, uh, man, it can be healthy to leave a church. But my sense in the season that we're in, my perspective is one of the dynamics I think we see happening is there is a temptation for, and many churches are doing this, to kind of plant a flag in a particular political quadrant,
Mm-hmm.
and those that are doing it are growing. You know, like it's a pretty big church growth strategy. You want to grow your church, you know, like just log in, you're going to draw out that corner. And my concern is that again, like these are almost like the new denominations that people are, you
Mm,
know, creating that
that's good.
again, it's again not so much around a doctrinal thing as much as a cultural thing and kind of planting their flag there. And often they can be making good points about one of those quotas, but there's often blinders to some of the dangers, the idols within that own camp. And so my concern is how quickly, I mean, I believe that God's vision for the church is actually that we could be united amidst difference in these kind of areas and learning and
Yeah,
growing together. And that these new cultural denominations, so to speak, are actually violating Jesus's prayer for the unity of his people. And so my deeper concern, if I were at a spot where I was like, do I need to go? It might be if I was a part of a church that was really planting the flag on the one and becoming more beholden to their allegiance, seemed more beholden to a particular political ideology than it was to Jesus as king,
yeah,
you know?
yeah. And I think for me, the issue there's obviously things you'll die. I mean, Gary Bashir puts these 4 categories together. He says things you die for, things you divide for, then there's things you debate for, and things you decide for.
Yeah.
And you draw a line between the bottom two and the top two. The top two are orthodoxy issues. The bottom two tend to be orthopraxy. And in some ways, I think people who have been wounded, maybe because there is a particular flag planted in a quadrant. The challenge is, how do I lead up well in a way that maybe I'm coming from you know um, take a progress quadrant, and hey, there's some ways we actually can progress without embracing progressive thinking that would collide with biblical values. How do I help people understand how someone in that quadrant or the identity quadrant might think, um, and just saying, maybe leading up in a way that, hey, let's listen and not shut down those conversations without demonizing, demeaning, devaluing is typically where I go. But it's tough. It's definitely a tough thing. My hope is, even having a conversation like this one about navigating the election season, is that we could do it in a way that models how Jesus did it with his own 12. I think that's a great example you've given. If he could do it with that group of people, man, he's got some wisdom we can tap into, and let's tap into King Jesus and learn from him. That would be a gift.
Yeah, you
So,
know what? A final thought along those lines too would be, as a pastor, as I'm looking at our congregation, or even to equip maybe small group leaders and all, looking for who are the folks that maybe feel on the outside of the norm in our church
mm,
environment. Like so. I remember, so I'm in Portland, and so you're going to have a lot of folks who more naturally lean a bit left. It's just kind of the blue water culture that in the urban core is swimming in. Although now I'm in a different part of town where it maybe shifted a bit, but I mean, I remember, uh, well, so my eye is on, okay, the person who, uh, lean, sometimes in urban core in Portland, if you lean right or you're planning to vote for Trump, right, like you feel like an outsider and kind of under, and like
mm,
I want to reach out to and listen to and hear how the people in my church are feeling, navigating even just the cultural waters, if they're in a spot where, dude, they're feeling uh like a minority in
mm-hmm,
the broader cultural waters of our city, and sometimes even just because of the dynamics of not what we do, And so now I'm at a spot where in West Lynn where we've got more folks who lean right, probably responsibility quadrant, I would say, is pretty high in our context here. And so I've kind of got an eye on, like, do I want to be reaching out to some of the folks who maybe would lean a bit more left, and like, just how
mm-hmm.
are you feeling? How are you doing? How are you navigating? What's this scene like? Asking questions just to kind of pastor and shepherd folks who um, are maybe, where do I fit? Where do I stand? To
Yeah,
cultivate that kind of, yeah, culture. I think it takes some intentional shepherding and having an eye on folks
yeah,
who, okay, here's the 99. Where's the one who might be feel a little on the outside of the norm in our environment here?
yeah. And I think too that one of the things I would say is that I find that I learn more and I grow in wisdom more when I'm asking better questions and making fewer statements.
Hmm.
Like, there are some statements to be made. Yes, Jesus is King. Um, but then it's like, hey, help me understand this, or to ask a question, and not be like not a trap question. It's not a gotcha question. It's literally a curiosity question
Yes.
of just learning from someone of how how do you process it in light of, if it's a believer, in light of what Jesus is saying. Tell me tell me how you've navigated those waters, and just learn and listen. I think it's super helpful.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
well, my friend, thank you for spending this past hour with us. I know that those who are listening have appreciated it, and for the sharing your slides and sharing everything. By the way, if you're I know there's most everyone's still engaged in the webinar. Thanks for hanging in there. And the resources will be emailed to you. We got slides, and some other things that will come your way that will be a resource to you in this election season. But Joshua, thank you so much for your thinking on this topic, and on multiple topics, frankly. And it's been great get to know you. I hope that journey doesn't end for us,
Same.
but I definitely
Same. Thank you so
appreciate
much,
you.
Steve, and you all. Yeah, thank you so much. Honor to be with you all.
Yeah, and a shout out to Rachel. Rachel's behind the scenes. Rachel, thank you for helping this roll so smoothly. I appreciate you. I know we both do, and blessings to everyone as you navigate this election season. Hopefully, it's not a bunch of bumps and bruises, but we actually come through the other side and go, "Wow, look what Jesus did."
Yes.
Yeah. All right, everybody.
Yeah.
We are officially over. So thanks for joining us.